that the coup d'etat, the pro-coup d'etat people, the golpistas, come to the realization that through barricades on the highways and armed attacks and the media war and the social media war using psychological warfare techniques, the classical psychological warfare techniques of lies propelled every day to generate hate and blame. All blame goes to the government. All blame goes to the president. You can watch the news program 100% noticias, 100% noticias. Not one thing happens in Nicaragua that isn't the fault of the government. Not one thing. So a policeman is killed defending Radio Ya as the hoodlums are coming to burn down Radio Ya, the principal radio station, the greatest audience radio station, pro-government. And so what is the spin they put on that in the false news? The policeman was killed by his fellow policeman because he refused to repress the demonstrators. The peaceful demonstrators were burning down the principal radio station in the country. This is the type of fake news you have. Including, this began with some fake news. The groups that are pro-coup d'etat have been trying to get an entry point for some time. They tried with the canal. They, people, when there's a large infrastructure project, they tend to be nervous, and very rightly so. They don't know what's going to happen to their farm, if they're going to receive just compensation, if they're going to be relocated in satisfactory terms. And so they took advantage of that to mobilize the local farmers in the canal route. They had some success at that. And they burned some fuel trucks and blocked some highways at that time. It was very localized, just on the east side of the lake and in Rivas, the route of the canal, taking advantage of that. Then they tried to stimulate their plan with a forest fire, which I found very exotic. How do you blame the government for a forest fire in a reserve area? But they did. They said the government was reacting too late. Costa Rica sent fire trucks to the border, and Nicaragua didn't accept them because they're of no use. It's 3 to 4 days on foot to get into one of the most remote areas of Nicaragua where this fire was taking place. The government reacted late because we didn't have the airplanes that could dump the chemicals on the fire and put it out. Finally, we borrowed airplanes for some countries and we put it out. I like to recall that Santa Barbara County in California, one of the richest counties in the United States, spent 3 weeks trying to put out a brush fire, as you might recall. It even burned into neighborhoods, and after that, there was flash floods in the neighborhood where Oprah Winfrey and other billionaires lived. One of the richest counties in the United States, and it took 3 weeks to put out a fire. So they put that out, but that doesn't resonate very much either. Then came the Social Security reform, and that is explosive. Secretary General Gonzalez, who used to be Prime Minister of Portugal, had told us that the most explosive theme for him was Social Security for any government. And we have had a policy of consensual relations along the ILO line, tripartite decisions between government, the unions, and the private sector. The minimum wages for 6 years were determined by consensus. 2 fiscal reforms, tax reforms, were approved by consensus. And a previous Social Security reform was approved by consensus. But that began to break down when the last negotiation of the minimum wage, the owners of the private sector were not in agreement with that. So they excluded themselves. Then on the Social Security reform, they didn't want their contribution on the payroll to go from 19% of their payroll to 22% of our payroll. But the IMF had been demanding this for some time. And I can tell you critically that this was not explained well, not communicated well to the people. So for example, they would say, oh, they're cutting the pensions of the poor pensioners by 5%. The reason for that was they were going to include them in the health care plan with free medicine. So it was really to the great benefit, but that wasn't explained well, wasn't communicated well, and that became explosive. Then there was a confrontation between the police and some protesters in which the police very obviously used excess force, that it was excess force. And that gave a resonance to this protest. But then you start to see the coup d'etat element come in, because they propelled the false news that a student had been killed. The intention of that was to inflame the students in the universities, and it did. So there was a massive joining of these protests by university students. The second day, there were deaths by the Leopoldo University. Those deaths were of 2 demonstrators and a policeman in a shootout, in an armed encounter. And then this took off, and it's spiraled subsequently, and it's gone through different phases. One phase was the looting. They started, you see, it goes into a phase and the phase stops. They move into a different phase. And the looting was very organized, really. The modus operandi was a group of people on motorcycles would show up at a store, Pali or Maxi Pali, or La Union, which are all owned by Walmart. And it's very inexpensive beans and rice, and this is where the poor people buy their foodstuffs because it's cheaper. And they would open up the locks, cut the locks, open up the metal doors. And that's pretty elementary, cutting locks. But then they would open up the cash registers, which shows a little bit of metal mechanic expertise. And then they opened up the ATM machines, the cajeros automáticos, without burning the money. And that's a lot of metal mechanic expertise, because those machines aren't designed to open up like a sardine can. And they did this without burning the money. So you could take a torch and just cut it all open, but they did it without burning the money. In the meantime, their accomplices were going out into the neighborhoods to invite the poor neighborhoods to a looting party, that the Pali was opened for looting, not for business. And then some people would come in and started looting. We had a saving and the way this stopped was when people came out of the neighborhoods to protect the stores. So the store got surrounded by a lot of citizens day and night, and they couldn't do this modus operandi in that context. And we had a saving grace with Walmart, because the neighbors in these neighborhoods, people know each other, so they knew who had been looting, and the neighbors and police went to the houses of the looters, picked up the merchandise and brought it back to Walmart. And Walmart said that they had seen looting in several countries. They've been looted, but they never saw the merchandise returning. So they were happy with that. But we were afraid, they're getting looted one after another. But then what happens in these circumstances? The middle class and the upper class swoop down on the supermarkets to clean the shelves. This is uncertain. This could be a civil war. We have to stock up on everything. You put more goods on the shelf, boom, they disappear. They go to the gas stations, fill the tanks up, and they take fuel tanks and fill those up, because there'll be a scarcity of gasoline. So you start to create a scarcity. Now they're continuing with this policy of trying to create scarcity with the roadblocks. So they put up the roadblocks, and the farmers can't get their crops to market. So the farmers are losing crops, they're losing money. A pound of cheese, the white cheese the Nicaraguans like, from Chontales, is 100 Cordobas a pound now, because they can't get it to market, so it's very scarce. And in blue fields, they can't send it to Managua, they send it down the Escondido River to blue fields. It costs 15 Cordobas a pound, where there's an excess of cheese floating around, and they're sending it over to San Andres, where they buy chickens that they can't get from Managua. So people are adapting to this lousy situation in some places where they can do that. But then these roadblocks also are impeding that people can go to work, because you have the bedroom communities around Managua, of Tipitapa, of Ticuantepe, and some neighborhoods there like Esquipulas, Veracruz, in Hinotepe, Diriamba. People who work in Managua, they can't get to work because of the roadblocks. Now, the large informal sector that lives by daily, gaining their subsistence by selling something or giving some service, they are really pressed to the wall because they're not getting that daily income. So it's a very desperate situation. And these are not peaceful protests. These roadblocks are imposed by violence and maintained by violence. You try to cross the roadblock and you will be violently dealt with. There was a fellow by the name of Francisco Arauz Pineda. He and another gentleman were helping the community clear up roadblocks in the eastern neighborhoods of Managua when they were shot. And Arauz Pineda is laying on the pavement. We don't know if he was still alive or dead, but there's no way of telling. But they took themselves, these vandals, these terrorists, the video of him there, and then you hear a fellow say, "Throw it on from a distance." They walk up and they douse him with gasoline and they burned him. And then, that's kind of like culture of the Islamic State. We haven't had that in Nicaragua. And the worst thing, to me, the aggravating factor is they were cheering. They were cheering with a great jubilation the burning body. And then they irrespective of the body, you see the charred hand. And if you can see this on the internet, you can find these internet. And they put a brass thing in his hand and says, "That's the trophy that you earned, you son of a bitch." And then they put an FSLN flag on the body, the charred body after it was burned. This is really alarming, the way it's degenerating into these sadistic acts. Another one last weekend was Sandra Bonilla in the ambassador's hometown of Leon. She was is a municipal orchestra director. She was Sandinista. She was captured by the terrorists, and you have her naked. They've stripped her with her open breast and her face completely bloodied, where they've been beating her up. And then there is a Monsignor standing beside, and you see his white garb, and only thing he can say in front of this tortured lady whose dignity has been stripped is, "Don't put that video on the internet. Don't put that video up on the internet," which they did. They do this. There's been policemen who they capture them, they kidnap them, they strip them, they're naked, they tie them to a post. This is like Abu Ghraib. Remember that in Iraq where they humiliated the Muslims by stripping them naked. Now there's another one you can find on the internet too. If you can't find it, we can send it to you, of a 15-year-old boy who they captured, Sandinista, they kidnapped, they stripped him, and then they painted his body with blue and then white across his genitals and his buttocks, and then blue on the bottom, and said, "This is your flag, respect your flag." And you can see him trembling. Not the hands, the entire body is completely trembling. And then they told him, "Run, run, run." And then they fired their homemade mortars to further terrify him. This has got to stop. And there was a clearing of barricades in eastern Managua also, in which the police and the citizens clearing the barricades were fired upon. A gun battle ensued between the police and these gunmen, in which you thought that you heard a Salvadorian accent in there. The Maras are coming in. The Maras are taking advantage of this anarchical situation. And the criminal gangs also have been enrolled for their services, and they're having a heyday, of course, when there is impunity. The delinquency in the neighborhoods is tremendous. And in this fire, a 14-year-old baby was hit in the head. Tragedies like that are going to continue unless this violence ceases. Unless this violence ceases. And the way for this violence to cease is through the dialogue. But every time you go 2 steps forward on the dialogue, something happens, you go 1 step back. Because the people who want the coup d'etat are trying to sabotage the dialogue also. And we need to have them reach the realization that the armed attacks, these outrages, atrocidades, you say in Spanish, atrocities in English, right? These atrocities are not going to overthrow the government so that the dialogue can proceed in a very much more serious manner and reach agreements. This past weekend, there was an armed attack on this residential neighborhood. You haven't seen that yet, even in the war, in which armed gunmen attacked the house of Francisco Lopez, the treasurer of the FSLN, and there ensued a gunfight from 2 in the morning to 6 in the morning. That's almost civil war. That's a lot of munition to be firing for 4 hours in AK-47s. And then you can find a letter of the residents of Lomas de Montserrat, in which they said that 2 priests arrived with a camera crew and some reporters, some masked men and some civilians. And they went out thinking they're going to interview them. They're the witnesses, they're the neighbors there. And they didn't interview them. They started interviewing their portable witnesses who weren't even there. And one of the oldest lady, they went up to a priest and said, "Aren't you going to interview me?" And the priest pulled her aside and said, "What you could say is not important. What's important is what they're going to say," which was to concoct more false news, a daily dose of false news to try to put the spin on that aggression in a neighborhood. My secretary has had her face and her husband's face put on the internet saying, "These are Sandinista youth. They live in such and such a place. They are inviting violence." You know, our ambassador to the United Nations, her whole family was threatened in this fashion. And then you have things like in a neighborhood or in a town, they wake up in the morning and there's an X, a yellow X on the house of all the Sandinistas, not the other houses, the Sandinistas' houses. That's reminiscent of the preparation for a pogrom in Eastern Europe, or the Nazis putting the Star of David on the houses of the Jewish people at the beginning of the repression. So this gives to instill the fear that there's going to be some kind of pogrom against the Sandinistas. The FSLN and the government have said that if the violence ceases, there is nothing that can't be put on the table. No theme is off the table. Advanced elections are not off the table. That can be discussed. If there's going to be advanced elections, when they're going to be held, that can be discussed. Now there's 2 other things here that are good news, and then there's some difficult news. The other good news is that the government last year signed an agreement with the Organization of American States for an electoral reform. And the OAS is working on that together with some Nicaraguan experts. And they are working on that, and they're going to consult the different sectors and regions of the country. And by January of next year, this proposal for the electoral reform would be ready, consulted, and ready for the dialogue to look at. Then you have the government inviting the forensic experts of the Inter-American Human Rights Commission to visit Nicaragua and accompany the Nicaraguan Commission for the Truth, Justice, and Peace, and study case by case all of these instances of killings, all of these instances of terrorist attacks, all of these instances of arson. That's another phase they went through too, burning down mayor's offices, burning down public offices, burning down things you don't understand. They burned down the mayor's office in Granada, Colonial Building on the Colonial Square, maybe some of you know it, very historic. We have denounced these attacks on the cultural patrimony of the country in UNESCO in Paris yesterday, and we denounced in the World Health Organization the impact on health of the roadblocks impeding the flow of passengers, patients, and medicines, and the impact on education also. So you have all of this going on, and these roadblocks need to be lifted, and that would be an important part of the cessation of violence. It's only with a case-by-case approach that these things can be clarified. You get these horrendous, gross generalizations based on nothing. Even the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights stated that there's been so many deaths that day, because every day it goes up while the tragedy continues, where the violence doesn't cease. And the vast majority of it by the police and government forces. Based on what? Based on what? No basis whatsoever. There are people who are on the dead list who show up alive. There are demonstrators killed. There's been Sandinistas killed. There's been policemen killed. There's been journalists killed. There's been merchants killed. There's been innocent bystanders killed in crossfires. That's very, very important element. But the false news to instill hate and lead to blaming the government for everything and instill fear in the population is part of this terrorist approach to try to overthrow the government. You can see the manual for this in Gene Sharp's manual he did for the CIA on how to destabilize and overthrow governments. Gene Sharp of the Albert Einstein Institute, which was used in Ukraine twice, was used in Georgia, was used in Kyrgyzstan. They tried to use it in Venezuela, but it failed. And you don't have to believe me on this. Miguel Mora, who is the owner and director of 100% Noticias, what the people call now 100% Mentiras, the one that blames everything on the government, he said, everyone must read the book of Gene Sharp. This is our guide. This is what we're following. So he declares that, and some others of them have done that also. I see some signs that the barricade thing is wearing thin because the people just can't put up with this much longer. And then you start to see the impact on the economy and on business. So there's a gentleman by the name of Healy, who is the president of the UPANIC, which is the large agricultural interest. And he came out last week and said the army should protect the agricultural lands in western Nicaragua against land invasions. So his position is, the country could go to hell, but protect my farm. So they're getting it to them, you know, because with this lawlessness, with this anarchy, you get these mass invasions of private property, which is the rural equivalent of the crime wave in the neighborhoods in the city. So there's a window of opportunity here. The window of opportunity is the Santo Padre, Francisco, is clearly on a pro-dialogue position. The church in Nicaragua has been just dual. They are the moderators of the dialogue, but some bishops are leaders of the pro-coup forces. And you see them, there's all kinds of videos of them giving the rousing speeches to the people on the barricades and supporting them. And the new nuncio has been sent, Monsignor Wenceslao Somertiag, who knows Nicaragua, has been there before. When I was in the Vatican and also with the Laico organization, the Saint Higdio, they were all very high on the role that Wenceslao Father Wenceslao can play in Nicaragua. Now, Cardinal Brenes and one of these leaders of the opposition movement, of the pro-coup movement, Father Monsignor Rolando Alvarez, has been called to the Vatican. I hope something constructive comes of that. There was a visit in Managua by Caleb McCurry, the Chief of Staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which is headed by Senator Corker of Tennessee. And after the visit, the U.S. Ambassador Dogu and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, so the State Department and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, emitted a communique strongly backing the dialogue. The Pope's position is that in a polarized society, one side cannot impose on the other side. If you have that in a polarized society, the violence will continue. Even if there was a coup d'etat, the violence would continue. The Sandinistas know how to block highways too. The Sandinistas waged a 20-year war to overthrow the Somoza dictatorship and resisted the U.S. military CIA intervention in Nicaragua for 10 years. Sandinistas know how to do this. We don't need that. We don't need violence. We don't need revanchismo. We don't need revenge. We need peace. So that the country, which has already taken a huge hit, can try to salvage what they can of the situation. This has to be solved by the Nicaraguans. But In the U.S. government, there's a window of opportunity because Senator Corker, who is the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, is not going to run for re-election. If the Republicans retain control of the Senate, he will be out in January of next year. Really, his power will diminish in November when the elections are held, what they call in the United States the lame duck officials who lose power because they're no longer going to have power. And the new head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, if the Republicans retain control, would be Senator Marco Rubio of Florida, a Cuban American. It's one of the groups of Ted Cruz, who sponsored the NICA Act, Marco Rubio, the Representative Ross Lieutenant, Senator Melendez of New Jersey, all Cuban Americans, who are pro-regime change. They're the U.S. equivalent of the que se renuncia ya, que se vayan ya position within Nicaragua. Even more serious is that Vice President Pence is in that position, with National Security Advisor John Bolton is hardline on everything in the world. And then you have the number 2 in the State Department, Sullivan, who is regime change. The UN Ambassador Nikki Haley went to Washington and gave a speech in the State Department with Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz there, saying that Latin America no longer has to put up with the authoritarian regimes of Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, evidencing her total ignorance of the huge differences between those 3 countries. To put them all in the same basket is quite exotic. Cuba doesn't have a private sector. They're just creating a little one now with family-owned enterprises. Venezuela, a good part of the private sector has been at war with the government now for about 10 years, maybe more. And in Nicaragua, the development has been private sector led. And the government's had a policy of consensus with the private sector that only broke down very recently. And that had led to the 3rd fastest growth rate in Latin America and the Caribbean, 4.6% average in the last 7 years. Foreign direct investment increased by 5%. It took us over a decade to get out of the reputation of Nicaragua as a violent country that impeded tourism. We achieved that. And now you look at the tourist magazines in the last couple of years, and they're always saying, top 10 spots to keep a vacation on a low budget. We're a cheap country. We would like to go further upscale, but it was bringing in tourists. And that's blown out of the water. 80,000 hospitality workers have been sent on vacation. And later on, they'll be laid off, but there's no tourists. And the Macul Hotel, which is the 6-star hotel in Nicaragua, is closed down. A resort hotel without tourists can't function. And so this means that also Nicaragua is the safest country in the region. You know, we have an anarchy. Nicaragua had managed to keep out the drug cartels. The Sinaloa cartel tried to penetrate Nicaragua and lost. They lost badly. They tried to send in a team of their cabecillas, and some sicarios, some murderers, and they all went to jail. 2 carloads were on the northern highway. A policeman pulled them over in a routine traffic check, and the policeman saw an arm outside of the window, and it had a $100 bill in it. And the policeman thought, that's a lot of money for a traffic infraction. And they got them out of the car. They were the capos of the Sinaloa cartel. They had drugs, they had money. Then they sent a jet from Mexico with a pilot in it. And they discovered in the panels of the jet $1 million. And the Sinaloa, this was to spring these guys, to bribe people to try to get their capos out of jail. And they lost the $1 million, they lost the jet, they lost the pilot. They fared very badly. Nicaragua has managed, and this is quite a feat, to keep out the MS-13, the 18, and the other MADAs that make life impossible in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, with kidnappings, with extortion of neighbors having to contribute to their taxes, this type of extortion. Mexico that has all kinds of kidnapping, standard kidnapping, express kidnapping, it's 1 day, super express kidnapping where they just take you to the ATM machine and clean out your credit cards and you can go. And Nicaragua hasn't had that. the lowest homicide rate in Central America, one of the lowest in Latin America. Only Uruguay and Chile are similar. The fellow who was the head of MAPRE Insurance, I told him that Nicaragua had the lowest car theft rate in Central America. Because car theft is a good indicator of citizen security. It's very, most crimes are underreported, but it's very hard that someone steals your car and you don't report it to the police. So it has a less of a non-reporting rate. And the president of MAPRE told me, Paul, it's not only the lowest in Central America, it's the lowest in the Western Hemisphere. It's lower than Canada. So you'd achieve that degree of security. And that's what was helping, quite obviously, the tourism and the foreign direct investment. It was the safest country. And so that has been lost. And then there was the social programs, which were very successful. The first day of the new government, President Ortega announced free universal health care and free universal education. This contrasted to recovery of costs that characterized the previous governments, in which they charged for medicine, they charged for external consultations, they charged for operations, and that excluded the poorest people. And then they did the trick that's in many countries, they cut the education budget and said, but the school directors can charge. So they started charging to take the test, to get the results of the test, charge to clean the building, charge for the security guard. And this all added up. And all of this excludes the poorest of the poor from health and education. We're talking about public health and public education. So this was very significant. It was a tremendous redistribution. Free health care with medicine in the second poorest country in Latin America and the Caribbean. That's part of the problem with the Social Security too. It's a system that the insured have their health care covered and their medicine covered. I am a hypertensive diabetic with a low thyroid rate and a large prostate. I get my medicine from the Social Security at 75 years of age, so that's not bad. But that has to be financed, and that's what this reform was about. And all of this had its results. Extreme poverty in Nicaragua was 17% in 2005. It was 14% in 2009. It was 8% in 2014, and it was 6% last year. So it had been cut in more than half, the extreme poverty. And as you know, on the consumption side, extreme poverty is defined as the family not consuming sufficient calories to maintain human health. So it's cruel, it's malnutrition, it's hunger. So all of that is being blown out of the water. And what we need to do is close ranks after this. We need to get out of the violence, have the dialogue, and get to an institutional, constitutional, democratic outcome of this. And that requires that only people who can decide who governs Nicaragua are the sovereigns, the people of Nicaragua. Las y los Nicaragüenses. International organizations can aid that process, but that's the solution that will heal. And this needs to have justice also. That requires the truth. That requires elucidating all of these cases. We need to go beyond that. We need to go beyond the lack of violence and get into peace building. And that requires reestablishing mutual confidence. Reestablishing mutual confidence, which has been badly shaken, quite obviously. And building peace. And I think that when we finally get the accords, international community can also help verifying the fulfillment of the different accords. But we have to even go beyond that. The task is great and urgent. And get into national reconciliation. Because such a small country can't be polarized like that. Can't be so divided among itself that you start to get these degenerations that we were talking about before. We have to get out of that mindset. And quite fortunately, Nicaragua was experiencing that. Because the Civil War of the 1980s ended in a negotiated process. The negotiations between the government and the Contra began in Sapua in 1987, the Sapua process. Then there was the Esquipulas process, in which the Central American countries agreed that the way out of the conflict in Nicaragua was through an electoral process. And we had the 1990 elections, in which the U.S. CIA-backed Contra, financed after 1984, when the U.S. Congress cut off the aid to them through the Iran-Contra financing scandal. But that was a spin, really. It's good that the journalists know that that was a spin. The whole Iran-Contra was a spin. And it was covering up the real scandal, which was the CIA cocaine scandal, that they financed the war by sending down the arms for the Contra and flying back with cocaine. And there was a movie made about this, Made in America, with Tom Cruise. You can look at that and you'll see the whole operation of the CIA establishing an airport for him to bring in the cocaine that he would dump in the Louisiana bayous, and then the planes would land clean. And that was how they did that. And they would take the cocaine to Los Angeles, where there was a gang head. It was called Freeway Ronnie, who was a very entrepreneurial type. And he took cocaine, which was an elite product, very expensive. You know, New York lawyers, Hollywood stars, athletes, this type of thing. And he made it into a mass market product using baking powder and his microwave, crack cocaine. And so there was an epidemic of crack cocaine in the black ghettos of the United States in the 1980s, brought on by the CIA. There was another movie called Kill the Messenger, about a San Jose Mercury News reporter who picked up on this, and they made life impossible for him. And he wound up on a blacklist, couldn't report, and committed suicide. They say committed suicide. We really don't know that. But that process, we got out of that through elections, despite the will of the United States to try to overthrow the government. And we lost. The low-intensity warfare had wound down the economy to the point we had 34,700% inflation in 1987. They would, the 10 quarter of a note, they would print in big black letters on the 10 quarter of a note, 10,000. And a couple of weeks later, 100,000. A couple of weeks later, million, big black letters. People didn't want money. You know what the unions were demanding? AFA. Arroz, frijoles, y azúcar. That is pretty minimalistic, huh? Rice, beans, and sugar. That's what they wanted to get paid in, not in money. But, you know, the people thought that if the Sandinistas won, we did a survey after the election and found this out, the war would have never ended, and our whole campaign was based on peace. So we lost that election because they thought Violeta Chamorro will come in, she supported the United States, the war will end, which it did. Took a while, but it did. And we had the first peaceful transfer in the history of the country from one political force to another in 1990, 25th of May, 1990. And the Violeta Chamorro government came in. That transition could have been really bloody. But General Humberto Ortega and Antonio Lacayo Oyunguren, may he rest in peace, got accords of transition, in which was an agreement between the government and the FSLN to avoid the violence. Then, in 2006, the coalition which wins the election was called Unida Nicaragua Triunfa, United Nicaragua Triumphs. That coalition consisted of the FSLN, a Partido de la Resistencia, the Contra, and Yatama, which was a Miskito Indian group that rose up in arms supported by the CIA against the government also in the 1980s. So no one could think you're going back to the war if all of the parties to the conflict of the 1980s were in the same coalition. And it was more than nominal. The vice president candidate who resulted as vice president of Nicaragua, a heartbeat away from the presidency, was Don Jaime Morales Carazo, spokesperson for the Contra, negotiator for the Contra in Sapua. So there was a Contra a heartbeat away from the presidency, but that was the real political coalition. And now we need to do that again. We need to have another process in which we cease the violence, in which we can construct an institutional, constitutional, and democratic outcome. That requires building confidence. That requires constructing peace that requires elections, and the sovereign, the Nicaraguan people, decide who's going to govern the country. But then it even doesn't end there. We need national reconciliation. Such a small country cannot be at each other's throats. We need to unify ourselves to try to put the country back together. We're talking about the second poorest country in Latin America and the Caribbean, and the hit is huge. In 2 months, you've lost everything that was gained in 11 years. And gains that were the envy of Central America and were taking the attention. But some people say, why did it happen in that environment? And I was reflecting on this, and some people don't want to see a successful left-wing government, like these Marco Rubios and Ted Cruz with his NICA Act. They don't want to see that. And if we look at this in Latin America, there's a phenomenon that Latin America kind of moves together. When there was the military dictatorships, country after country after country, and military dictatorships. When it was the return to civilian rule, country after country after country went back to civilian rule. It's not some magical thing. The United States is pretty much involved in the instauration of the military with the overthrow of the Allende regime in Chile and other processes. But then you have now the rise of the left-wing governments in Latin America. And that happened at the same time. And now there's the rollback from that. It began with the coup in Honduras, an institutional coup aided by the military. Paraguay, an institutional coup. The institutions of state against the executive overthrew the president. Now in Argentina, they're trying Cristina Kirchner, trying to break the power of the Peronist party. In Brazil, they overthrew Dilma Rousseff through an institutional coup on a ridiculous pretext of budgetary procedures. You could overthrow every government in the world over budgetary procedures. And now they're trying Lula. They're trying to break the power of the Partido de los Trabajadores do Brasil. And now it's Nicaragua's turn. In Bolivia, they went through everything. Assassination attempts on Evo. There was an island in which some European hitmen arrived to make an attack on a whole cabinet in an island in Lake Titicaca. And then the CIA tried to divide the country. They wanted Santa Cruz, remember, to pull out of Bolivia on the most racist of appeals. Oh, we're the ones who produce the wealth in this country. Why are we financing these Indians up in the mountains? And it didn't work. The Bolivians held us firm and the country together. Now the left is divided in Ecuador too. It's hard times. Now it's Nicaragua's turn. Now Nicaragua's turn to see these destabilization and attempts to overthrow the government. But we're going to prevail. The violence will be overcome. The barricades will be overcome. And then the really difficult part will be the building of peace. I worked in the United Nations for 17 years, and then putting together electoral machinery, working on electoral rolls and on cedulación, on the national identity cards. That's, there's experts who know how to do that. It can be put together. Pacifying the country is a much greater challenge, and that's required for a successful dialogue, and it's required for successful outcome to this in terms of putting the country back together again and salvaging what can be salvaged of the national economy and trying to overcome the ensuing economic crisis. So I'm at your full disposition for any question you may wish or comment.